So welcome to a conversation with Tom Campbell, a title that he chose, Do Museums Matter? I'm happy to see you here. I was just told we're up against the cure for cancer, but at least we have some diehards for the arts here. So Tom Campbell is the 9th director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Previous to that, he was the curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts and the supervising curator of the Antonio Ratti Textile Center at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He is the author of Henry VIII and the Art of Majesty Tapestries. Thank you. I can read my own handwriting, Tom. At the Tudor Court, editor of Tapestry in the Baroque Threads of Splendor, and principal author of Tapestry in Renaissance Art and Magnificence. So first of all, why this title, Do Museums Matter, when in fact, in your tenure, the Metropolitan Museum had more visitors than ever in its history, or in 40 years at least, in 40 years, not its history, with over 6 million visitors. Why would you have any question that museums, or at the very least yours, matters?
I mean, it's a question that's supposed to be obviously provocative, but it perhaps reflects a lot of thinking that's going on in the museum sector at the moment. The Metropolitan was set up in 1870, as were many of the other great museums of America, at a time when Americans couldn't easily travel. So there was great justification in bringing works of art from around the world to America, at a time when information was primarily disseminated print on paper, at a time when other forms of entertainment were relatively hard to come by, other forms of education for large proportions of the population were hard to come by. And we've done a very good job for 140 years, like our peers, in addressing a particular kind of audience. I think there is a lot of questioning going on in the museum industry at the moment because we're conscious that so much is now in flux. Travel is so much cheaper. People can see works of art in the countries from which they originated. Through the internet, people are deluged with millions of images. The demographics of our audience are changing. We're now receiving visitors from all over the world. The demographics of the American population are changing. By 2040, the Caucasian population will be theoretically in a minority based on current growth rates. Traditional sources of funding are falling away. So I think that while institutions like the Metropolitan are very, very healthy, there is nonetheless a lot of thinking going on in the museum community about how we keep ourselves relevant in this changing world.
Well, in addition to demographics and globalization, which you're certainly pointing to, what are some of the other things that could test your relevance?
Complacency. Every generation, I think, rediscovers the meaning of history, goes back in, looks at the way that our predecessors have interpreted the past. And I think that that is a very valid issue at the moment. The charge often raised at institutions like the Met, of course much too easily, that we're a museum that celebrates dead white men. Now, there is to an extent, much of the history that we record was especially European colonial America, is formed by the body defined by that. But as an encyclopedic institution, we want to be truly global in our approach to the world, in the stories we tell. So I think that it's an exciting moment for us to recognizing our international audience, huge growth in numbers from Brazil and from China, for example, making sure that we are telling stories that really are engaging to all of our audience, locally,
And
nationally.
in a real
internationally.
way, by the way, I'm obsessed about sound. I'm hearing an extraordinary echo. Are you? Yes. Can we do anything about that? Tech folks? Okay, we'll proceed, and hopefully they will fix it.
Work on the feedback.
Because at least where I last was in Door Hosier, the sound was pretty good. So in a real way, on a day-to-day way, because I know there are other people who have other kinds of leadership who are in the audience right now who are affected by some of the same things. In a real way, on a day-to-day way, in how you staff, how you organize your staff, who's on your staff, say, different than with your predecessor, how you think about your public. Tell us in a real way how you're trying to face this new need for a different type of storytelling.
I think it's expanding the storytelling. When I took over as director 5 years ago, I took over an institution that was very, very healthy and had for almost 30 years placed scholarship at the center of its programming. So we weren't creating blockbusters to bring in the audience. We were creating scholarly exhibitions that grew out of the work of our curators. And long may that continue. I'm very dedicated to continuing that scholarship. But I think if we were missing something, it was the energy that we might be bringing to our permanent collections. We have one of the greatest permanent collections in the world, encyclopedic, spanning 5,000 years, maybe 7,000 years of world history, if you could include a few very early pieces. So I wanted to bring fresh energy to our permanent collections, the way we interpret them to the public. In part, it's by making sure that we're fully staffed. We boast of being an encyclopedic collection, but at the moment, for example, we don't have a curator of Native American art. We don't have a curator of post-conquest Latin American art. So there are areas that we need to bring new, fresh attention to.
Do you have the actual art, though?
We have some of the art.
You have some of the art. Uh-huh.
The contemporary world, I think, was an area that had been neglected. So we're doing a lot now. We can come back to this, perhaps. We're doing a lot in bringing fresh energy and attention to late modern and contemporary art. But the other sphere, the other part of the answer to this is in the digital realm. I don't think anything has perhaps changed the potential of museums to engage with audiences and the way we engage with audiences more profoundly over the lifetime of our existence than the rapid changes that are now taking place in the digital sphere.
Well, say, first of all, something about how many visitors you do get to your site, would you say?
Well, physically to the building, last year we got about just over 6 million. And
face-to-face, but online,
face-to-face.
What are you getting?
Last year we had about 50 million individual visitors, which has grown from 4 or 5 million 10 years ago. And so that's an exponential growth, and it gives us, through the internet, we now have the potential, in addition to the experience that our visitors have when they come to 82nd and 5th, we now have the potential to reach a global audience. And that takes a lot of investment. So when you ask about staffing up, the biggest change that's taken place at the Met since I became director is that I created a digital media department. I've restructured the IS&T department, and we probably have about 100 people working on digital media alone, on the back end and on the front end. So that's a very big shift.
And of course, as you know, in higher education, there's a big conversation about MOOCs. What would you tell your colleagues? I mean, you're also, obviously, the Met is an educational institution. What would you tell your colleagues who are thinking about MOOCs in terms of what we gain and what we lose by investing in that? And what should be our relationship between that and face-to-face?
I guess I'm the product of a kind of British tutorial system, both at school and at university. I was privileged to have, if not one-on-one time with teachers, one in very small numbers. When that's good, it's good. When it's bad, it's terrible. But that's an inspirational process, which I hope will remain at the core of teaching, certainly higher education, for many years to come. But I think at the same time, through the digital sphere, we now have the potential to reach not just that one inspiring teacher who's in your college, but inspiring teachers all over the world. And so what I say to my staff is, look, the potential of your audience is almost unlimited. And in fact, we've made a big investment. We started a project called the Timeline of Art History back in about 2000. And it's literally a story of art told through objects belonging to the museum. And at the time when we launched it, I, like many other curators, was very skeptical of its power. But in fact, over the years, the team who were building it persuaded more or less the entire faculty to contribute. And we now have about 1,000 essays, short 800-word essays online, beautifully illustrated with works from our collection. And the proof of the pudding is that this now receives 1/3 of our online traffic. And so for all of the talk about social media, what we're also seeing is this national and international desire for the authoritative voice. And so for me, that's the best demonstration of the power of this whole MOOC development.
So it also means something about what happens when that person does arrive face to face, right? I mean, how do you seize that desire for some type of authority, some type of person to help make sense of it? What's going to be different when you walk into the grand hall?
I think we've got, through the internet, through the website, we've got the potential to reach out to people and educate them about our collections, about art, about the significance of culture. So obviously only a small fraction of those people will actually make it to the Metropolitan. And for many, that alone, the online experience, will be an end in itself. But hopefully for those who actually come to the museum from that experience, their understanding of the works of art is richer. They've now, in this modern age, if they want to find out more information, they can just reach into their pocket and pull out their smartphone and access more information in situ, without us having to plaster the walls with lots of verbiage and lots of heavy-handed didactics. They can almost choose their own level to enter. And then hopefully when they go home afterwards, enthused with new curiosity, then they can follow up and dig deeper, share their experience with friends and family. So I think it's not one or the other. It's a new enrichment, a new interface.
And I want to ask you a couple of other questions about the community, because even in this audience, there are people who are representing different sizes of institutions and places. Maybe there's somebody here who doesn't even want to use the word museum anymore, that are bringing audiences and publics in relationship to works of art. Galleries, smaller institutions, people from elsewhere in the world. There are new players now who weren't there when you started out at the Met as a curator. How do you see that bigger community of cousins?
Well, we're closely linked with our peer institutions, in terms of exhibitions and scholarship. There's a huge ongoing dialogue all the time. With the broader community of cultural and entertainment organizations, I think it's important for us to keep an eye on them. In a way, museums have, in the last, really since Tom Hoving, the director in the early 1970s, launched blockbuster exhibitions that began bringing very large numbers of people to the Met. He kind of opened up a sort of an entertainment side to museums that was shocking to some at the time, but in fact has become very much part of the world in which we're living. Museums are seen by many as places of engagement, of socializing. It's nice if there's a good restaurant, a good bar, place to wander around, have a date, have a good concert. There are many facets to the museum experience. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to watch very carefully what's happening in the world around us, including in the commercial world, where obviously for P&L reasons, businesses have invested very heavily in their visitor engagement. So, for example, if you go to the Apple store now, you don't even engage with a checkout counter. It can all be done on a handheld automatically. And I think that we need to be conscious of that. Like it or not, our audience is being shaped by that experience in the world.
So you mean you'd get rid of the big circular information desk?
I would never get rid of
nice ladies. Nice ladies.
I'd never get rid of the circular information desk. No, people love that. People love a human interface.
I mean, it's bad enough you've gotten rid of the buttons.
Come on. Well, look. Two things. No. I would never get rid of the interface with greeters and receivers. But I think we can streamline the way people buy tickets for concerts, the way they make donations for admission, the way they book things. It will all be done. When you go to the airport now, you don't necessarily have to have a ticket. You just, you've got your check-in pass on your iPhone. I think people will increasingly we need to be doing that too at the museum. As for the buttons.
Did you bring any with you, with this particular crowd, or to have some privileges?
My takeaway at the end. Look, the buttons are dearly beloved, but so was the horse-drawn carriage. They are impractical. They fall off. To count how many we've given out at the end of the day, we literally had to weigh bags of leftover buttons. Try explaining that to the auditors. And now there's such an opportunity for us with printed tickets to, we can do timed ticketing so that people don't get too crowded in exhibitions. We can give people information, like the fact that they can trade in their donation to become a member. We can give them special offers. So the detractors say, oh God, it's also commercial. But again, it's part of this enhanced visitor experience. We're still just getting there, but they can perhaps choose different languages to have information printed out in. So I have delayed getting rid of the buttons for almost 5 years, but it really was time.
So another idea about community I was thinking of, so the Met repatriated 2 10th century Khmer statues and sent them back to Cambodia. And Pluan Prem, who is the executive director of Cambodia Living Arts and is going to be in the next session, wrote a very interesting op-ed about that. Very, very grateful that the Met did that, but also calling for sort of that's not all that could happen, calling for ways to help enrich both the old and history of master artists in Cambodia and to bring about a new generation of those who are practicing old forms and creating new forms, and asking, for example, for the possibility of exchange programs. Do you see the Met in a kind of relationship in the world? And you probably talk a little bit, do you have those kinds of relationships where it's not just to settle an old score?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
We're seeing our European peers, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Berlin Museums, Tate, for example, making a great deal about their international programs at the moment, their international strategy. And in part, this is being stimulated by the fact they're getting funding from their governments, and they're being used as tools of soft diplomacy. It's almost a neo-colonialism, building up relationships with museums and cultural institutions in the developing world. For me, there's room for all of us. It's it's bittersweet because we've been out there doing this for 100 years. We were leading excavations in Egypt as early as 1906. And before the Second World War, we had excavations all over the Middle East, working with the source countries. We were funding the excavations, and we were dividing the results of the excavations with the source countries, which was the sort of the standard best practice of the time. After the Second World War, when that practice sort of gradually fell away, we nonetheless continued to lead excavations for purely scholarly reasons, giving our staff field experience. And so they had a really good understanding of the context from which our collections came. In the last 50 years, really again since the Second World War, we've been part of a network of international institutions that do big loan shows. So we work with peer institutions all over the world, primarily, especially in Europe, but in the last 20 years also to a degree in Asia, bringing objects to America, sending our objects back. And similarly, we have a very active exchange program of scholars. We bring fellows. This year we've had 50 fellows from all over the world. That's an annual program. We bring in curators, we bring in conservators. We have a regular program with the Egyptians. We've brought people from Afghanistan and from Iraq. We, to an extent, send our conservators back. So we are a very, to advise and to work in the field. So we're very international in our activities. Could we do more? Absolutely. I think that, I'm a strong, of course in my position I would be, I'm a vehement defender of the role of museums like the Metropolitan and like the British Museum, which have encyclopedic holdings and allow our visitors to kind of compare and contrast across the development of cultures over the ages. I think there is something very unique to that experience and very important when it's inspired by the right scholarly and educational goals. But the kind of the momentum that allowed institutions like the Met to collect in such volume through the 20th century are now changing. And we are, so the bigger, one of the other big changes we're seeing at the moment is that as the developing world, as you see new prosperity in Latin America, in Africa, the Middle East, and in Asia, we're seeing with new emerging middle classes, they have a new interest in their own heritage and culture. And with the result that we're seeing a boom in museum building throughout these regions. And there's now a great need for information, for advice, for us to sort of help them. And we're doing that very, very willingly.
And presumably for them to help you.
And for them to help us. So I think the future is an international dialogue on an even larger scale than we've been able to have it in the past.
It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about contemporary art and how this sort of vast influx of capital into contemporary art, what's that done to the market and what's it doing to museums?
Making it very expensive to mount exhibitions. The Met was some of the founders of the Met were contemporary artists. Artists like Frederick Church, the great Hudson Valley painter. So we've had contemporary art at the Met since our founding, although of course now those are old masters. Our engagement with modern and contemporary art has waxed and waned, most famously during the 1920s and the 1930s, when the modernism of the day didn't sit comfortably with the kind of the direction of the Met at that time, and with the well-known result that MoMA and Whitney and other museums were formed to cater to late modern and contemporary art. But since the 1950s, 1960s, the Met has been re-engaging with modern and contemporary. And I think in the last 15, 20 years, it's become clear that our audience is very interested in seeing modern and contemporary at the Metropolitan. And so that's one of the things that I'm now trying to facilitate. We're building up a larger stable of curators of contemporary. And as I think many of the audience will know, we're taking over the Breuer building, the building in which the Whitney Museum is currently housed, in late 2015. So that will give us additional space to do programming in late modern and contemporary. Regarding the prices, I mean, the contemporary art field is being skewed by various factors at the moment. Vast capitalization of a fairly small number of contemporary artists, fueled by the fact that people can now borrow and invest against art. fueled by an influx of money from the Middle East, from Russia, from Asia, particularly China. So the prices are going through the roof. We'll see what happens. Certainly makes borrowing objects more complex.
Well, so for folks who don't know, tell us about who are some of the rock stars, to be perfectly crass about it, and what are some of the works going for?
Well, I mean, you know, the rock stars, I mean, it's not, you know, this is the subject that future art historians will write PhD theses about, because it doesn't, the high prices don't necessarily have anything to do with artistic ability. It's to do with marketing, without meaning that to imply any negative about some of the artists whose works are currently being the subject. But you look at the auctions at Christie's and Sotheby's. I mean, a Basquiat painting sold for $48 million the other day. You know, there are a lot of Basquiats out there. It's not as if it was the last one coming to market. It's not as if this is one of 10 works by a great master who died in the 17th century. You know, there are several hundred Basquiats. Warhol, Picasso, Jeff Koons. I mean, these are artists.
Does this mean we could pick up a couple of cheap Rembrandts?
Well, Rembrandt begins to look like rather good value. There's a lot of speculation going on, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to it.
Talking about money, I saw you and Christine sitting in the back row of the last panel, and I was wondering, if you could give us a little quick thumbnail history lesson going from English tapestry patronage to Kickstarter.
Well, maybe there are two questions there. I mean, I think in a way the Met, actually, no, Thelma put it in a broader context. Thelma said the origin of crowdsourcing is the collection plate
at the church,
at church or at synagogue, to build a new roof. So that goes deep in sort of the European American tradition. Is very deep. That vein of philanthropy goes deep in America. In a funny way, the Met was kind of a 19th century Kickstarter, in contrast to the European museums, which are mostly formed on the basis of former royal and ducal collections or government collections. The Met had nothing. The MFA had nothing. The Philadelphia Museum of Art had nothing. The Cleveland Museum had nothing when they were founded. They were founded by visionary Americans who wanted to have museums like the great European museums, which would be centers of learning and of stimulation and of example for designers. They were very practical. When the Met was formed, we had design school for designers designing wallpaper and carriages, amongst other things. We were crowdsourced in some respects, and that's been sustained over, in the Met's case, 143 years of amazing philanthropy by primarily for the Met, primarily New Yorkers, but also other Americans to an extent. And it's a great model, in contrast to the European museums, which are languishing as government funding dwindles and dwindles. Not that we don't have to work hard for it. But.
Yeah, well, you do, I'm sure. So I always like to open up for a couple of questions early on and then come back. So is there anybody who would like to ask us a question as we proceed? And can everybody hear in the back? You can hear? All right.
And with the echo seems to have gone.
Let's just bring that mic on down. And how about you, the lady in the white shirt in the front here? Yeah. Tell us your name.
Excuse me. My name is Mary Ann Pollock, and I live in Connecticut. There have been several galleries in New York that have recently had shows that rival museum shows of contemporary art. And I wonder, how does that help or take away from the Met's ability to showcase contemporary art when these are really very high-level contemporary art shows in galleries?
I think that one of the positive things about the huge investment in late modern and contemporary art is that some of the galleries have, they have much more money to work with, and they've been able to, they are able to mount, Gagosian can employ a John Richardson and mount, quite a significant exhibition of, say, Picasso paintings. I think there's room for all of us. I just think the important thing for the public is to, remember that this is a, commercially funded enterprise with the specific goal of selling works. And the important thing is that, of course, is when people come to our galleries, there's no hidden agenda. We are an educational establishment. But, New Yorkers are pretty sophisticated.
One more question from the crowd. Yes.
Ron Schiller from Aspen Leadership Group. Wondering how the role of museum director and perhaps boards you're working with, but how the role of museum director has most changed in the last 5 to 10 years, and the ways you think it will change most in the coming 5 to 10 years in terms of the artistic vision versus the running of the business, and so on.
I think that it's probably in the business side of things. We've become bigger and bigger businesses. The Met's operating budget last year was $250 million net, of which about 1/10 came from the city. About 1/2 is the spin-off from our endowment, which has been built up through private donations. And then the other 45% is from other revenue streams, admissions, membership, merchandise, and so on. And I think that it's a big pie chart, and that is being a successful business in all sorts of ways, being successful with your visitors, being successful with your donor bases, has become a very big part of the work of any director of any large museum. How is it going to change in the next 5-10 years? I think it's this internet thing. We're all having to become digital natives. But the other big part of it is globalism, that we have an opportunity because of the scale of our collections, because of the levels of our funding, because of the internet, we can become, I hate the word brand, but we have the opportunity to have a global presence. And if we choose not to, others will move in there. But we have such opportunity to be a platform of authoritative information, but also a platform in which our audiences engage at every level, from the scholarly to school children. So I think that's going to be making that work and making it global, figuring out how to do this in multiple languages. I think these are going to be interesting challenges and opportunities in the future.
I think there's something in Ron's question, though, that, if I read it correctly, that's also about leadership. And I wonder what your trajectory, what was it for you personally to go from being a meticulous scholar? And one of the things that even interested me about inviting you here to Aspen was having that opportunity to be with you in a weekend of museum directors, me being not one, but being very taken and impressed and drawn to how deeply you read and how meticulous a reader and a scholar you are. So what was your process from going from a scholar of tapestries and a curator of tapestries, that type of looking in very deeply, to being caused to have to look outside? And some of the things you're saying today are about looking outside, whether that's about globalization or something you alluded to earlier, changing demographics in the U.S.
Well, I sometimes feel like a pilot in that movie, The Right Stuff, when they're experimenting, and it's been kind of fairly rapid acceleration process. As a curator, through pure accident, I had in my mid-20s, I became fascinated by the subject of European tapestries as these beautiful woven paintings that were so important, especially during the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the Baroque, when the kings and the rulers of the day spent enormous sums of money having these very, very elaborate tapestries woven in the finest materials from designs by the leading artists of the day. And it wasn't just because these were nice and warm, although, of course, the portability and the insulation were factors. But the real reason they were so highly valued was they were seen as works of art in their own right, and they were tools of propaganda.
Yeah.
They were a way for the rulers of the day to project the ideas that they wanted to be associated with, whether it was association with great heroes of history or mythology, or whether it was with religious ideas. It was propaganda. And I became interested in the subject when I was in my mid-20s. And what really struck me was that there was this whole industry of art history. There were art history faculties all over the world with very eminent professors. There were thousands and thousands of books about the history of art. You could fill an entire wall with books on Rubens alone. There was this whole developed art market, and yet, for all of this specialization, there was almost no attention being paid to tapestries, even though many great pieces survived in the royal and ducal collections on continental Europe, or mouldering away, in museums around the world. And for me, in my mid-20s, this is fantastic. Here was this amazing subject that I, needed solving, needed someone to care about. So I became a curator. I became a specialist in that field. I ended up at the Met as a curator because I saw the Met as a place where I could mount really big exhibitions and write really big, really beautifully illustrated books.
Which otherwise probably couldn't get published,
Which I wouldn't have been able to publish, exactly.
Extraordinary books.
So, and I think that, how did that translate into my experience as a director?
Yeah, your intellectual journey, really.
Yeah. I had the good fortune to realize in my mid-20s that how complacent the popular point of view can be, how wrong great experts can be because they are too
Well, how
silent.
about your TED Talk, which you begin with a teacher of yours asking you, what's this? And you said a bacchanal by Titian. You thought you were pronouncing it incorrectly when he kept saying, a what? And finally he said, it's a fucking orgy.
Yes,
And you
exactly.
said that word fucking on TED. I'm just quoting you.
Well, you did it. That was another part of it. It was realizing that, you want to cut through you want to get to the truth. And the truth, of course, is a moving target, but preconceptions so quickly become commonplaces, become law. And my role as a curator was delving back into the archives, resuscitating this lost subject, and bringing attention to these beautiful, beautiful works of art that are falling apart for lack of attention. And I feel, in a way, my role now as director is to do the same thing.
So, and also it strikes me when you say it that way, that you couldn't possibly come in this job with an assumption of what the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art is supposed to do, given the grandeur of its history, right?
Yeah, I think I had the good fortune to have my predecessor will go down, Philippe de Montebello, will go down in history as one of the great directors of all time, building up the Metropolitan as a leading exemplar of scholarship, of learning. He was a grand man with a grand manner and a grand voice. I think if I had thought too much about that when I became director, I couldn't have got out of bed in the morning. I just kind of came in, I thought, I'm going to take this one day at a time. I know there are things that I either know I want to do now or I will find out that need to be done. And, here I am 5 years on, and I'm busier than I can think. But
So, we're all reading in the press. I'm asking you this question so you can tell your side of the story. We're reading in the press this whole thing about the class action suit, about the people feeling they aren't really given a chance to pay what they want and so forth. And I'm sure we in the audience have also a lot of different ideas about, you know, who does a museum belong to? What is our responsibility as citizens to keep it nice and healthy? So tell us your side of the story of what's going on with this class action suit.
Sure.
Right?
The class action lawsuit is based on the premise that in the late 1890s, when the city of New York made a grant to the Metropolitan, at that time, the Metropolitan agreed to be open for free 5 days a week. Now, that was when the Metropolitan occupied a footprint of 1 acre. 100 years on, we occupy a space of 8 city blocks and are, the biggest encyclopedic museum in the world. As we have grown to that size over the decades, and New York City funding for the museum has fallen away because, of course, the city can't afford to fund an institution of that size, especially when there's public support that will support us. We have had that 1897 statute has been replaced by a whole sequence of subsequent agreements, and in particular from the 1970s, when we introduced the idea of a voluntary admission, of a voluntary donation. We've worked with the city. The city has always approved. Every time we've increased the recommended donation, the city has approved it. So the fundamental basis of the lawsuit we contest is flawed, and it will have to go to court. In the meantime, we're the subject of a lot of somewhat negative publicity in the press, because of course the lawyer working on contingency is trying to try this case in the press, that we should be free. Well, I'd love to be free, but we make $40 million a year from admissions. The last time we had to cut, back in early 2009, when I became the director, and we were going through the financial recession, our endowment fell by basically about $250 million. We had to contract our operating budget for a year-on-year basis by about $20 million. And to do that, I had to contract the staff of the museum by about 400. So if I lost $40 million of admissions revenue, I would have to greatly reduce my staff. I wouldn't be able to do any of the great exhibitions we do. We'd have to reduce all of our educational programs. So that is not a direction I want to go in. I find the whole lawsuit especially galling because at the time of that financial crisis, in late 2008, early 2009, we had plenty of people in our community saying, well, look, let's turn our voluntary donation into a compulsory admission. MoMA's done it, many other museums have done it, why don't you do it? And at the time, I felt very strongly, as did our board, that it was really important to keep it voluntary, because while it's very nice if someone who can afford to pay the recommended admission of $25, it's very nice if they do so, I don't want to be exclusive. I want someone to come, I want our visitors to come to the museum, whether they can afford to or not. I remember my wife and I going to Boston shortly after I became a director, after I became a curator in America. And we went to the Natural History Museum in Boston. And we had 2 little kids, and it was $100. And we went in, we couldn't take the kids, we couldn't leave at that point because the kids were so excited about going in. But for us at that time, it was really a big slice of money. And I think about that experience every time people tell me you should have a compulsory charge, because I want those young families with young kids to be able to come in without that problem.
It's very important. So I want to open it up to the audience again, but as you know, Tom, I'd like to see if you would like to ask them a question.
Sure. I mean, do you want to have a question first, or should I start off?
You start. Ask the crowd a question.
Well, I mean, here am I. I think my most important job is to make the Met relevant. We're not just a stuffy art history lesson. The objects we hold were made, some are great works of art, made by talented artists, working for sophisticated patrons, but a lot of the objects we hold are essentially cultural artifacts, ranging from, a tea kettle made 5 years ago, kept as an example of modern design, to ceramics made 5,000 years ago. And I want our collections to be relevant. I want our collections to be a place where our visitors can find their heritage, understand more about where they're coming from, who they are. But the best, I have to hear how we can do it better.
So the question is how
Yes.
can the Met be more relevant? Is
What
that
can,
the
what,
question?
can, what can we do better?
What
Yeah.
can they do better? So
Yeah.
let's get the mic coming.
What bothers you?
Okay, I say the complaint department. Say
Hi.
who you are.
Madeline Grinch from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Hi, Tom. I think what's troubling me a little bit about the question and also about the title of the session is that when I arrived here for my first Aspen Ideas Festival, this seemed to be the only title in a session of all the sessions that I saw that had a kind of underdog or defensive positioning. Everything else is very positive, very optimistic, very future forward. And that gave me pause. And I do think that for some reason, museums right now these days seem almost embarrassed even to call themselves museums. The Museum of Modern Art right now at PS1 is repositioning itself at this thing called Expo One as a festival as institution. I don't know, I'm having trouble with that because meanwhile, every formal and informal cultural avenue, commercial and non-commercial, are adopting the attributes of museums. Pinterest calls itself a curatorial website. Triple Canopy magazine calls itself a curatorial website. Auction catalogs take the attributes of incredible scholarly museum books. Commercial galleries are doing the R&D search of acquisitions and exhibitions. And the commercial sector has co-opted those attributes to be a force for good as part of every marketing campaign. And meanwhile, we are conducting that work, and we've conducted that work from the beginning. And in response to that, I don't think that I think we should say that we are relevant. I think we are relevant. I think you've explained, Tom, just listening to you, everything that you've said is infused with relevance. I mean, we museums put our choices under ethical pressure every day. We museums don't have as our bottom line social profit. We, as museums, are a civic platform. We are more publicly a civic platform than, let's say, the Aspen Ideas Festival.
Well, Madeline, I think you're absolutely right. But I think that museums and cultural centers in big towns, especially towns with strong tourism, are, as we know, absolutely booming. But I think that there is, as we're both part of the same dialogue at AAMD and other institutions. I think that for cultural centers and museums that are not benefiting from that tourism stream or are not benefiting from strong benefactor circles, there are real challenges. I mean, you just have to look at what's happening in Detroit at the moment.
Right, what about Detroit?
Yeah, I mean,
Talk about Detroit for people who don't know about it and what you think about that.
Well, here is one of the great museums of the country, built up on the prosperity of the auto industry during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. I mean, one of the top 7 or 8 collections in the country that is now totally devoid of funding in a city that is essentially bankrupt. And the city is even talking about monetizing the collections. Now, I don't think they'll be able to go there.
But even that it went that far is a critical moment.
Yeah.
Let's see, before we move on, if anybody has anything that they feel Tom could do to make the Met more relevant. Yes, in the middle with the sunglasses.
I understand it's very difficult to display carpets and tapestries. And that's why they stay rolled up, like the one that got rolled up and finally sold for a huge amount of money. Why don't you start thinking about new ways of displaying those precious objects by way of perhaps rolling out, whatever, using new technologies, give the museum visitors a chance to see them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to an extent, we are doing exactly that with digital media. We are now, I mean, about 4 years ago, I mandated that we should have all of our collections online, and now every single accessioned object every catalogued object is on our database. So you can find it by browsing. In terms of displaying the objects at the museum, we're fighting modern technology is still coming face to face with the relentless impact of light. Light damages light-sensitive dyes and textiles. So there are certain categories of ancient objects like tapestries or drawings, and new objects like photographs and film that are slowly or sometimes rapidly disintegrating. And obviously one of our responsibilities is to preserve those, to find the right balance between preservation and celebration. We can't put things in a black box because if we do that, then people won't see them. But we've got to be we need to try and find the responsible, the right balance.
So I brought up some bad news or a controversy, but there was a flat-out wonderful piece of news that was not controversial at all, and that was the gift from Leonard Lauder, which I hope it doesn't embarrass him. He's here. Of course, we're particularly proud that he's on the board of the Aspen Institute, but might you say something about Mr. Lauder's gift and what that will mean to New York and to the Metropolitan Museum?
Yeah, with
and
pleasure.
To the world.
I mean, as I said earlier, the Met was formed by civic-minded New Yorkers who, over a period of 143 years, have built up one of the great encyclopedic, perhaps the greatest encyclopedic collection in the world. There have been thousands of individuals tens of thousands of individuals who've donated and supported across a whole spectrum of degrees, from their admissions, their voluntary admissions, to donations of works of art. But then there is a small circle of donors whose gifts have been so transformative that they have lifted the museum to a different level. And that includes figures like Morgan, Lehman, Reitzman, Annenberg, and Leonards Gift is in that transformative degree. It's I talked about the importance of showing modern and contemporary art at the Metropolitan. Leonard's collection of Cubist paintings is the finest in the world, and it will provide a whole new foundation to the way we tell the story of 20th century art. So it's thrilling for us.
And I see two more eager questions, so I know we're coming to the close of, how about you with the dark hair, and then Eric?
Thank you. Ellen Sussman. Sorry, Ellen Sussman. And I was actually going to skew off Leonard's Gift in my question, which is sort of about benefactors and how museums can court them more appropriately. Because today, what are the impacts of all of the private museums that wealthy people have decided to start to open, instead of doing what Leonard did, which was taking a world-class collection and saying, here, I want it to enrich my city, I want it to enrich the United States, and I want it to enrich the world. I find it sort of sad today that so many people, and I understand that they want their collections to stay in one place, and often that they want to be sure they're seen, which is a big issue when you give to museums, because a lot of times some of the pieces are better than others and some get seen. But how do you make those benefactors realize that perhaps giving to the Met or the Whitney or the Studio Museum of Harlem is really the best place for their work and their money, ultimately, instead of opening their own museum?
Well, no, it's a very good question. The Met is as great an institution as it is because a sufficient number of private collectors have had the vision to realize that the significance of the collection they built up will resonate to an even greater degree in the context of other collections around it. The trouble about these single collector museums is that the model, as time passes, they're very hard to sustain because the virtue of an institution like the Met is that many people can contribute to it. Whereas if you've got a museum with a single name on it, it's that much harder to encourage others to support it. So it is a conundrum, and you see it, particularly in the Los Angeles area, where there are a number of historical museums that now are having to find new ways forward in terms of fundraising. But that said, there are some very great single collector museums in the world.
How can you, as directors in plural, work? The question really is, how can you work to try to change that tide, to try to say, hey, long-term this isn't sustainable. We are sustainable. We have the resources.
Well, it sounds like you've just answered that by saying that is the one argument that you have to make. Eric?
Well, my question is a variation on that same theme. How do you as a director...
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
My question is a variation on that same theme. How do you think about, as a director, the institutional commitments that have been made to donors? And I think of the Frank Barnes collection, and I know that was an independent institute, but a lot of the restrictions that are put on showing art and the placement of art in museums, and with the expansion of collections and contemporary collections, how do you manage those commitments from Mellon and Carnegie and others in the past?
We obviously, when a donor makes a gift to us, there's a contract with a range of specifications, and we take observing that commitment very seriously. And the Met is a tapestry of interlinked collections, some of which are shown in entirety as collections, others of which are dispersed. But we work very carefully to be respectful of the requirements of the donors, even if it sometimes ties us in knots.
So I know we're out of time, and the only last thing I want to remark on is when I asked you yesterday if you were to redesign the Met, what you would do. One thing you would not do is to get rid of the Great Hall.
I love the Great Hall.
So you're not afraid of this idea of the cathedral in the square that some critique about museums?
Anyone can walk into a cathedral. Anyone can walk into a cathedral. It's not an elitist process. It's an inspiring process. And so, it's one of the most wonderful spaces in the world to walk up the steps at 82nd Street, to be in that grand, lofty space, to know you can walk in any direction, and you go to Egypt, you go to Oceania, you can go to medieval Europe, you can go to America in modernism. It puts you in a contemplative frame of mind where you're ready for suggestion, where you're open to new experiences. It's fabulous.
Well, thank you so much for coming to Aspen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Real pleasure.